3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
So welcome. This is not the first in a series, but we're doing panels this year in honor of the celebrations for Apollo 11 being 50 years old. So for that, I'd like for you to meet Joe Vallely, Space and Rocket Center, and he's the one we're working with to try to put these things together. So
thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. There are a lot of people working together on many of these projects, and thank you all for coming out on a cold, raw night. I've already realized we may underestimate the emotion that the Apollo program brings to this community. So I'm really looking forward to good turnouts for a series of activities that we're pleased to be involved in. We're happy to work with Heidi, the German-American Heritage Committee, and the Legacy Panel Committee that is part of the Space and Rocket Center's efforts. Did I say it wrong?
No, that's right. I was going to say Benny's back there and Jack Stokes.
Benny and Jack are here, and they also serve on the Legacy Committee. It became very apparent that those groups and organizations really should merge to be able to bring you the best programs that you could do. So it's part of a community-wide effort that Mayor Battle appointed Dr. Deborah Barnhart to head up, and these folks serve on her committee. They're working very, very hard to bring you things. I told our media partners here tonight who are here to record history that you may hear things you've never heard before, and you may never hear them again.
I guarantee that.
You never want to. If it's historically true, we want to record it, and we want to archive it for history, because 20 years from now, 50 years from now, what did you do when you celebrated Apollo 11? For many of you here tonight, and our community as well, it's not just Apollo 11, it's the entire Apollo era. We want to connect that workforce to today's workforce and tomorrow's workforce and inspire them. So we're grateful for your participation. We're grateful for our volunteers' participation. We're excited to have a host of programs here and at the Space and Rocket Center throughout 2019, leading up and beyond the July mission week of Apollo 11. So thank you, Heidi. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to having you out each and every time. There is a calendar at huntsville.org, the Huntsville Convention Visitors Bureau, and it's getting to be in final form. For a while it was updated every 1 or 2 weeks, but we think we've got a good program in place now. And I invite you to go to huntsville.org under the Apollo celebration, and you'll see a schedule of our events, and with our media partners we'll work to get the word out. Thank you again. Y'all have a good program tonight. Thank you for letting me come speak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vallely. All right. Well, we'll dive right in. So you've come here tonight to hear about family life in Fort Bliss of the Werner von Braun team family members. We have 4 here today. I also am one of those. So actually we got 5, don't we? And then out in the audience, we've got quite a few more. So we've got good support. And Klaus Heimberg, at one of the panels we did this summer, mentioned something that really fits. You would think that we got together and talked to each other all the time. That's not true. This is bringing us together, these panels. So it's been wonderful. We all had our early lives, our careers, school careers, and went on off and did our things, but now we're coming back and enjoying the amazing history we all had. And in the community here, of course, so many of you worked with Apollo, so what a history we've got here. And that's something that we like to share here. So let's see, 2 of these fellows went into aerospace engineering, the 2 on the end. This fellow, PhD in chemical engineering, or chemistry. And this lady started out with finance, worked at the Arsenal for a while. I'm sorry, mathematics, right? Her father would be very upset with me for that. Right, Dr. Motsek. So, but she, right, in mathematics, but then she left that behind for arts, and she's great pottery. She's very well known for her pottery. So look up Ursula Van if you get a chance. So, see, we all went on and did other things, but now, at the end, I'd like for there to be a group photo, please, of the ones, the children of the team members, so we'll get up on the stage or come up here or on the stage for a group photo, if you don't mind staying behind. So I know you're going to want to talk to some audience members, but do please try to get up on the stage for that. Because it's a different group that's together every time. So, now here's my disclaimer. In these panels, we are not discussing any of the specific rocket scientists or what they did or did not do. We are simply providing the stories of children, of team members, and what our lives were like growing up. Our topic this evening touches on America's early space history, delivered by 4 children who are sharing their stories of what it was like when they arrived in Fort Bliss, Texas, they got there in about the end of 1946, and we all lived there. I was born there, but we all lived there then until 1950, when the whole team moved between March and September, moved to Huntsville, Alabama. Little background. At the end of World War II in 1945, the U.S. government had sought to gain German expertise by securing top scientists, engineers, doctors, professors, and others, foremost in their fields of endeavor. Of those, a number of close to 2,000 that were brought to the U.S. between 1945 and 1970 under Operation Paperclip, there were about 128 rocket specialists, as they wanted to be known, plus their families, who were kept confined for 4 to 5 years in Fort Bliss, in the William Beaumont Annex housing, so it was all fenced in. So that's for the stories later on, that's important. So after that time, it was determined, and there are various reasons for this. I was asked at lunch today, the Germans decided to come to Huntsville, Alabama because it reminded them of Germany. And I said, no, we didn't. We didn't have that choice. That's right.
No choice.
They were still prisoners. This was all done, I understand, from Michael Baker, that on the floor in a general's office, so I'm guessing the chief of staff of the Army or something, in the Pentagon, General Toftoy, then Colonel Toftoy, got on the floor with maps and things and said, Huntsville's where we need to put these people. So, and John Sparkman was certainly on board with that, so Senator John Sparkman. So that's really why we came to Huntsville. They didn't really have a say in it, but they sure were happy when we got here. So for today's panel, our time frame focuses on 1946 to 1950, the time these German families were reuniting in Fort Bliss. So again, the wives and children were brought after the husbands, the scientists, had been there for about a year. A little more background. So they were given 6-month contracts at a time. The Americans thought, we can learn everything they know and we'll send them back. They were taking care of the families in Germany. They were all kept in a compound as well there.
They didn't tell them everything right away.
No, they didn't. And I've talked to another gentleman that was U.S. Army, he retired a general, and he said, we were guarding your dads. We were trying to write down everything we could as fast as we could, but we soon figured out we couldn't learn it all from them in that amount of time. So 6-month contract, 6-month contract, then yearly contract. And they said, okay, we're bringing the wives and families over. So that's pretty well the way it transpired. So now, first we will have Ursula Motsek Van, and she'll go back a little bit in her story, so she'll give us some continuity from what it was like coming from Germany over. She arrived with her mother, sister, and brother in Fort Bliss, Texas in June 1947. Since 1950, Ursula has resided in Huntsville, Alabama, raising her family here. She graduated with a BS degree in mathematics from the University of Alabama in 1961. She also worked as a summer student for ABMA and later NASA each summer while at the university. She worked at NASA for a while, but eventually then stayed home to raise her family. Child care was not always an option back in those days, if you can relate.
Yes.
Okay. So then she found a love for pottery, and that's what she's become quite famous for. So Ursula will start her story again, talking first about the early days in war-torn Germany.
Yeah.
Ursula and Motsek Van.
Are we here?
Is it on?
I think they said it was
Okay,
on.
good. The first part is about our trip from Nestimitz to Fort Bliss that I wrote down. I've written a lot of this down. Oh, okay. Sorry. It's about our trip to Fort Bliss. I've written a lot of this down for my children because I'm the last one that remembers all this now. It's from Nestimitz to Fort Bliss. On a sunny day, early in June 1947, our family of four, my mother's two siblings and I, arrived in El Paso, Texas, and were reunited with my father, whom we had not seen since very late 1944, early 1945. The long journey began almost 2 years earlier in the Sudetenland of my birth. The war was over, but the conditions had worsened considerably. The city of Aussig, where my grandparents lived, had been heavily bombed. Our small town of Nestimitz, just a few miles down the Elbe River, had been pretty much spared. Our spacious home and belongings had been confiscated by the Czechs, and we were moved a couple of times to ever smaller houses. The last was a two-room frame house with no plumbing and no heat except the coal cook stove. Fortunately, one of our neighbor families from the big house, the Mullers, were also in this compound, and their son Gunther was my best friend from those days. Food was very scarce and rationed. My mother bartered and begged with the storekeepers for a few items to keep us going. And I remember being sent to the store one time with a ration book to get some milk for the family. I was probably 11. It was basically the winter of the potatoes, as we had a supply in the storage space under the floor. During most of 1945 and early 1946, my mother had no idea if my father was still alive or where he was. She knew he had been at Peenemünde, but she had not heard from him for a long time. When a letter finally arrived from him, in the early spring of 1946, it was to tell us that he was indeed alive in Bavaria, and the American army was taking him and his co-workers to America, and that we would follow. This was a dark time for us and continued for a while. In the spring and summer of 1946, almost all of the ethnic Germans who were living in the Sudeten part of Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic, were deported. Thousands were shipped out by freight trains, sometimes in boxcars and sometimes in open cattle cars, to the American zone in Germany or the Russian zone, which later became East Germany. My grandparents left before we did. Somehow my mother knew when the train from Aussig would be passing through Nestimitz, and she and I were at the railroad station, and she wanted to toss a small package containing a loaf of bread to the car in which my grandparents were. I think she missed, but someone else, I'm sure, benefited. Our turn came to leave a little later in the spring. My mother with a rucksack and the carriage with my brother, who was one and a half. And I with my school satchel was in charge of my sister, who was 3. We were fortunate that my father's older sister, Tante Annie, and her 2 teenage daughters were in the same group. We were also very fortunate that we traveled in a boxcar rather than an open one. Somewhere near the border in Germany, Wiesau, I think, as best I remember, we spent the night in a refugee camp, and I was pleased with myself that I had smuggled a small gold medal on a chain that I wore under my clothes. The rest of the train later continued to the Russian zone. Miraculously, the American army knew to get us off the train to continue our trip, and I learned recently that my father had probably alerted them to how we were traveling. I have some records of a book in Aussig, of Aussig history that details the dates and destinations of a number of these people shipments. And I also have gotten recently copies of a number of the documents that he signed during the vetting process by the American Army. My daughter in Nashville found them on the internet. The next leg of our journey was by army truck, the kind with a canvas over the top of the bed. The 7 of us, my aunt and 2 cousins, rode in the back to Landshut, Bavaria. The army was collecting the families of the von Braun team from all over the country, and housing them in a complex of buildings until the transfer to America. My grandparents were already in Landshut. My father had made those arrangements as well. We shared an apartment with him, and it felt very good after the many months in the baracca. My father was at that time already in America, and I think we missed him by about 6 weeks. He had left a small stash of chocolates and other treats for us. He wrote often and sent many care packages. Along with the food the Army provided, we slowly recovered. A photo of my mother and the three of us children, which I have, and she had taken as soon as we arrived in Landshut, mailed to him because there had been no photographs for the previous year and a half, I think. Many of my father's letters to me contained pressed wildflowers that he had found in the desert. And unfortunately, those letters were lost after I saved them for a long time. The year we spent in Landshut was good and felt normal. For the first time, I was allowed to go to school. The schools in Czechoslovakia after the war were for Czechs only. So my mother, who had been a teacher, once taught me some at home. In that one year, I was in the last few months of first grade, and then the next school year, I was in second grade, but soon was moved to third grade with a few others because of lack of space. Beginning in 1946, the families in Landshut were being sent to America in small groups. Our turn came in May 1947. A group of perhaps a dozen families, herded by Major James Hamill, left by train from Landshut to Bremerhaven. It was hard leaving my grandparents, who had been such a strong presence during the war years. I never saw them again, although my parents visited my grandmother later. In Bremerhaven, we boarded a troop transport, the General C.C. Ballou, which was returning soldiers from Europe. And I wonder what they thought of this little group of German refugees watched over by Major Hamill. Crossing the Atlantic took about 10 days. I made friends with Inge Bergeler, and we spent a lot of time exploring what we were allowed to. Inge was a couple of years older, so remembered more of the trip. We recently reminisced while attending a function at the Space and Rocket Center. She said we played a lot of card games while we were on shipboard. The ship probably docked in New Jersey, as best as I can find out. As we were all in Army custody, we did not go through Ellis Island. We spent several days at, I think, at Fort Hamilton in New York City. Finally, we boarded the train at Grand Central Station bound for Texas. None of the Germans were allowed to leave the train for the entire journey, so Inge and I played more card games and did some sightseeing. We crossed a huge river and was told it was the Mississippi. As we got further west, the countryside turned from green to brown, and somewhere along the train stopped at a station, and all we could see was flat brown land with some scrubby vegetation. This was nothing familiar, and we wondered about our new home. On this trip, too, we were introduced to many new foods. In particular, I remember cornflakes, which was a new taste and concept, dry cereal, and especially canned orange juice. After 3 days on the train, we finally arrived in El Paso. My father and the other fathers were all there to meet us. This would be my first ride in a passenger car. Transportation in Germany had been trains and streetcars and walking. My father had bought a gray 1941 Oldsmobile sedan, and it was, to us, very, very nice. And 3 years later, it brought us to Huntsville. This was also the first time my father met his 2.5-year-old son, since we had not seen him since late 1944. And the next section is on living in Fort Bliss. As I said, my father also met his son for the first time. He had not been home on leave since early January 45. I have some photographs, and I think that's about when they were taken. He did have a photo my mother had made of the four of us shortly after we arrived in Landshut in 1946. By that time, he had left for America about 6 weeks earlier. My brother Wilfred was named Bushy as a baby, and this became Bushy in school. And when he was grown, he became Bill. In Fort Bliss, the whole team, plus families and a number of Americans and GIs, were housed in a fenced compound with MPs at the gates. On the outskirts of El Paso, the single-story barracks had been an annex of the William Beaumont Army Hospital. This compound was not being used and belonged to the government. It was located a couple of miles from the hospital at the end of a long straight road from the Franklin Mountains east. Biggs Army Airfield was across this road, and the El Paso Airport was beyond in the desert. And I just as last week found a small map of El Paso in an old road atlas, and I was right about the locations of all those. The one-story barracks were being converted into apartments and offices. All the long buildings were connected at the end by long enclosed hallways, probably once there had been doors to each building. The halls had brown linoleum floors, and the kids soon learned that they were great for roller skating and playing and running and getting reprimanded for that. There were 3 residential streets, A, B, and C. The streets were also connected by enclosed hallways with openings at the street crossings, and this could make for a good bit of walking if you visited friends in the next street. The team was at Fort Bliss for about a year before the families started arriving. Most of their pay was transferred to the families in Landshut, and soon the men were sending packages with many of the necessities plus treats that were so scarce in post-war Europe. I know my mother sent Dad the outlines of each of our feet for new shoes. In Fort Bliss, before the families arrived, a few of the men built furniture. My father made several pieces based on some of the furniture we had had to abandon. They were sturdy utilitarian pieces, not finely finished, but they served us well for a few years. One of the very few pieces he bought was an armchair, a very mid-century modern rattan frame with cushions. I still have it and use it. And I think it must make it a family antique. The cushions have been replaced and covered, but it looks pretty good. Another project of his was a series of thin plywood cut-out wall plaques of characters from Grimm's fairy tales. He had used watercolors to paint them, and they too were fairly crude, but again, they were based on some I'd had in Germany. And these still survive with my Nashville daughter. When we first arrived, our apartment was not ready, and we shared the whole barracks building with the Holderers, Oscar, Inge, his mother Oma Holderer, and the son Thomas, who was also about 2. Bushy and Thomas became lifelong friends. The large room at the end of the street became our living room in one corner and playroom. The back of the building had a hall and a series of rooms and a kitchen. Most of the meals there were communal, which was a big help for my mother because the Holderers had been here almost a year and were getting familiar with the new foods. One of the rooms was...
May I interrupt you just a minute? Because we have Michael Holder.
Michael.
Right there.
Right here.
Hey, I forgot you
He was
were
just
talking about your family. You weren't here then. Oscar and my father had a dark room in one of those rooms, and I was occasionally allowed to sit in there and while they developed the film. It was fascinating to see the images appear on the paper. They documented events around the compound as well as the surrounding area, and as I understand, they took pictures of documents for other families. So this was offered to other families. They had a small business going. We soon moved to our apartment on B Street. It was next to a building that had become offices and drafting rooms. Beyond that was one of the crosswalks and then the small PX. Our family had the unit in the back, and next to us were the Fuss family. And then Bruno Heusinger, and finally Rudy and Doretta Schlitt. There was a sizable group of children, roughly my age, 7 or 8 to 10 years old when we arrived. Dodgeball, kickball, roller skating were favorite outdoor activities, among the girls anyway. A swimming pool was at the compound, and many of us learned to swim there. The well-known photograph of the entire team in 1946 was taken in front of that pool. The first summer, 1947, the Army, which was in charge of us, organized a summer school to teach us some English. Later, there were informal classes held by some of the parents, and different topics. I was in a group taught by Mrs. Heller to keep us up with German grammar, etc. And Mr. Angela had some informal sessions teaching his daughter Crystal and me about the basics of drawing, like perspectives and that sort of thing. Come September, the whole group of school-age kids was bussed into El Paso to the city schools. I was put in the 3rd grade at Crockett School with 2 other German girls in the class. They were Ursula Motsek and Marianne Rudolph. It was a bit scary being dumped into a class knowing so very little English, but we were well received and each was assigned an American student to guide us. Mine was Raquel, a Hispanic girl who took good care of me, but still a lot was strange to us. For instance, an assignment of having to pick words that had to do with summer from a list on the chalkboard. Some I recognized, but picnic was a totally new word. Another incident was when lunch included a tamale, and I think I was hungry that day. I and several others attended Crockett School for the low and high 3rd and the low and high 4th grades. The teachers and students were all very welcoming. In the low 4th, I had a very memorable teacher, Mrs. Downstairs Brown, to distinguish her from Mrs. Upstairs Brown. She spent much time on social studies, and we had a long study on the Rio Grande and the lands along the river, and did a lot of drawings for that. And I loved the drawing part and kept that report for a long time. The teacher for the high 4th grade was one that did not seem to care for us German kids, and it was the only time I didn't get a gold star on my report card. The following year, a group of us was moved to Houston School for the low 5th. We were again a curiosity. Only Crystal Angela and Helga Minning were in my homeroom. It was a good half year with more interaction with the American classmates. A couple of birthday parties were fairly complicated undertaking, both distance-wise and rules we had to live by. For the high 5th, second half of the 5th grade, we were moved again. Our little class of 5th graders and our teacher from Houston School, Mrs. McAngus, were housed in a self-contained building somewhere between Fort Bliss proper and our compound. The students were all Germans and Army dependents. It was a fairly informal situation. The playground was just sand, so we couldn't play jacks anymore like we had at Crockett in Houston. And I don't even remember the lunch situation. It must have been sack lunches. But transportation to all the schools was by Army bus with an MP on board to keep us in line. And they watched us across the roads, and you had to toe the line there. On weekends, we were allowed to roam further. Our family, like many others, spent time exploring the region. My father really loved the desert and its plants and the mountains and the rocks with ore in them. Outings to the Sacramento Mountains in New Mexico, to both Cloudcroft and Ruidoso, were favorites. There's a national forest in the Sacramento Mountains in contrast to the Franklin and Oregon Mountains, which were rocky and desert. The Sacramentos are also site of the Mescalera Apache Indian Reservation, which was another first. We also visited White Sands, New Mexico, National Monument, for a number of times. Those high gypsum sand dunes were great for sliding down. Remember that? And then there were several trips to Carlsbad Caverns where you could eat lunch in a box, get a box lunch far down in a large cool room, and the rock formations were impressive. Closer by in El Paso, there were also a number of outings, shopping downtown in a multi-story department store, lunches of soup and sandwiches. The family also went to a real rodeo, and we made a number of visits to the museum at the College of Mines, which is now University of Texas in El Paso. They had a large rock and mineral collection, and you could see it by ultraviolet light, which really changed the colors. It's amazing. McKelligan Canyon at the base of the Franklin Mountains was a favorite area for picnics and hiking. And further to the east were the Hueco tanks, again a good area for hiking. It seemed like my father made sure we visited every national monument, national park, and significant site that was in driving distance of El Paso. When we learned that the team was to be moved to Alabama, we had our grand tour of the Southwest. It was a several-day-long trip to Arizona and parts of New Mexico we had missed. We saw the Grand Canyon, the Painted Desert, Petrified Forest, Meteor Crater, Montezuma National Monument, and several other sites, and then went down Oak Creek Canyon to Phoenix, where the temperature was 110 plus degrees. And then we went back to Fort Bliss by way of Silver City, New Mexico. And I am really grateful that my father was interested in visiting all these places. It certainly has influenced my later outlook. Another episode is that our family and our friends, the Holderers, each bought 1 acre lots in a new development north of the city called Sunrise Acres. Oscar actually finished a small house built by hand about the time we learned that we would be moving to Alabama. And they never got to live in it. My father spent the time at our lot preparing the house site and working on plans. About this time, late 1949, 1950, the government decided that the paperclip scientists and families could apply for U.S. citizenship. This meant leaving the country and entering again legally. Juarez, across the Rio Grande from El Paso, was the choice. We rode a streetcar across the bridge, and it took a visit to the U.S. consulate for paperwork, and then we had to return to Texas. After 5 years residency from that date, we would become naturalized citizens, and the final ceremonies all happened in Alabama. Soon we had to make the trip to Huntsville, still in the 1941 Olds, and there was a dog as well as the 3 kids by this time. And in true form, we did a lot of sightseeing along the way. I remember the McDowell Observatory, the Alamo, and stops in Houston, across Louisiana into Alabama. We crossed under Mobile Bay in the tunnel and finally arrived in Huntsville late one evening. I was somewhat prepared for our new environment in Texas. My father had written many letters describing the desert in El Paso. He sent a number of postcards, and some of his letters to me had pressed desert wildflowers taped to them. So arriving in this wonderful sunny place was like moving from a black and white, mostly gray movie to a bright Technicolor one. The atmosphere was optimistic and everything seemed possible.
Here we have Heidlum Voss Admire. So you heard
Yep.
his family's name mentioned
Yes.
as well.
We were neighbors.
Yes. Now next we're going to start kind of a song and dance routine between these two at the end. They were best friends, sneaking out of the fenced encampment, Fort Bliss, and then ended up college roommates, so still best friends. But Uwe decided, so this is Klaus Rosinski, Uwe Hüter. Uwe, right? Uwe. That's Uwe. Okay, so now he decided this time he would have something a little more formal to show you. So we'll start with your presentation and then we'll go into the song and dance routine.
Okay.
So it's a wonderful travel log. But hold on just a minute. Marion Bledsoe is here. Would you stand up, please? Yes. I'm sorry, Marge Bledsoe.
Oh, you
Yes.
Awesome.
Oh,
Military support to my grad scheme.
Yes.
93 30th Research and Development.
I'm sorry, what?
93 30th Research and Development.
Isn't
Yes,
that
Neat.
it's amazing.
So, yeah, I
yes.
had to-
I went to Crockett
I
School.
remember when you were playing, of course, I was in about 6th grade and 7th grade.
Okay.
I was a little bit older than you. But I do remember when we would wait for the bus, the military bus with the MPs.
Yeah, with the MPs, and
Yes.
boy, I got in trouble once by walking around them.
Good to see you.
Okay, well, I'll give you a
Small
little
world.
background on these two. So Uwe Hüter was born in Schweinemunde, Germany in 1940 near Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea. Lived in Peenemünde, moved to Landshut, Bavaria, where the families were kept for a while. Came to America in 1947 to El Paso. Moved to Huntsville in 1950, went through several schools here in the Huntsville area. These
I think
two went
all
off.
of them. Went through all the schools.
Yeah, right, went through all of them, yes. And then they graduated at the University of Alabama. So, yeah, Uwe became an aerospace engineer. He worked for NASA for 41 years, so many of you know him, I believe, on Saturn, Skylab, Shuttle, and other future launch vehicles. He did a wonderful talk at Dr. Stuhlinger's memorial service, so, on futures vehicles. So then you began to work as a contractor for SAIC, and
Correct, yeah.
so you have now retired.
Yeah, I retired from NASA in 2004 and worked as a contractor till about 2016 when I finally decided to just hang it all up. So I've become a bum since 16.
We're glad he's got free time now, so we're glad he does. Okay. And then he's married to Peggy Starnes. He married her in 1964, and they have 2 children, Stephanie and Sonia. So, welcome, Uwe. Let me go ahead and give Klaus Rosinski's intro. He came to the U.S. in Fort Bliss in 1947 at the age of 7. Moved to Huntsville in 1950, into the same rental house on Locust Street that the Von Braun family had just vacated. Piece of trivia there. Then again, you attended schools in Huntsville, East Clinton Junior, Huntsville Junior High School, University of Alabama, roomed with Uwe, and then ended with your 1966 with your PhD in chemistry from the University of Alabama. You began your career in 1967, Owens Corning Fiberglass, and you worked there for, I figure here, 31
Many
years.
years.
A lot of years. You retired in 1998, and he and Louise now live in Gulf Breeze, Florida. They have 2 children and 5 grandchildren.
Very good.
So,
Right.
welcome, and if you'll, Uwe, if you'll
Okay.
start with your presentation.
Thank you, Heidi. Can you hear me okay? Okay. What I decided after the last lecture that we had in September is to maybe try to put something in a more chronological order so you can see the kind of path that we took, how we migrated all the way from Peenemünde into El Paso, or all the way to Huntsville, actually. So that's what this is about. And I did it a lot for myself because there was a lot of things that were kind of a little bit foggy in my brain on where we were, what we did, what time it was, and what ship did we come over, who was on the ship with us, and all this stuff. And so I'll go through some of that and show you what we've done. Let me see if I get this right. Okay, yeah, this is sort of an itinerary of where we went from all the way. Well, actually, my dad started in 1930 at Kummersdorf or the Tegen Flugplatz, which was near Berlin. And this was in the early 30s, and they were doing a lot of pretty elementary type research at that time. It was just starting, and they were playing around. I'll show you a picture of some of it. The procedures they were using were not exactly OSHA standards, but it was rather interesting how they went about their work. And then in September 40, I was actually born then in Svinemunde, which is about 30 miles from Peenemünde. And I guess the reason I was born there is because of the hospital located there. And but we were living at that time in Peenemünde. Now in 43, we moved to Kerpensee, which is just down the road. And I think the reason for that move was the British were starting to bomb Peenemünde in 43. And so apparently some of the apartments must have got in bad shape or stuff like that, and some of the families ended up moving out. And so this was just down the road, like 10 miles down the road. And from there, after the Kerpensee, in 45 is when we started doing the trek to the south. The Russians were coming in from the east. The British were sort of occupying the northeastern part of Germany. The Americans were occupying sort of the lower half of Germany, and the Russians had sort of the northeastern part of Germany. And so they were within about 100 miles of Peenemünde at that time when they decided to start heading south. In a good way, actually. Heading south means something else normally, but this was actually a good turn of events for us. And we ended up in Landshut in 45. We stayed there till till we came over in May of 47. Or in June, we ended up in Fort Bliss. And then we stayed in Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, from 47 to 50, moved to Huntsville, and then we moved all the way through Huntsville. I went to Joe Bradley School, Fifth Avenue School, East Clinton School, all in one grade. So I was just, one step ahead of the sheriff the whole time while going through the school system. And then we ended up finally at 1409 Locust Avenue. My parents built a house, and we stayed there and finally put some roots down and stayed there till I graduated from high school. My mother lived in there for years and years afterwards. The house is now gone, but it's that same place. You've probably heard of Kraut Hill. There was a lot of Germans that were living on that one last block of Locust Avenue. It was Tessman, our family, Heimberg, Schilling, Von Braun was right behind us, Grunis, Dravers, Siebers, or Manteuffel at the time, I think they were there. And Palo, well, he came later though. That was that was later. But in the early 50s, those were the people living there. And so anyway, we stayed there and sort of settled into Huntsville and a life off the road finally. Now, just to show you kind of what happened there is, in Berlin is where my dad started, and he married my mother, Ruth, in Berlin. My oldest brother, was born in Berlin. And then in about 39, they moved up to Peenemünde. So from Peenemünde, then they moved to Kalpensee. I was born in Swinemünde. You see, it's right now, it's actually Poland now. The borders kind of moved after the war. And you can see how they spell it. I can't even pronounce it, but it's still Swinemünde to me. And so after in about 43, after we moved to Kalpensee, we stayed there till 45, and then we started taking the trek down. And in March of 45 to July of 45, we lived in Wied, which is sort of central Germany. All of the scientists and people working on the rockets kind of went to Central Europe. That's where they were getting out of the way of the Russians. And at the meanwhile, von Braun and Magnus, who actually surrendered in Austria to the U.S. Army, says, hey, we want to come to America, happened at that time. And then apparently they got the green light, and we ended up moving down to Landshut in 45. That was in July of 45. So in May is when the first contact was made on the surrender of the Germans. And so it was a pretty quick timeline considering that how all this happened, because things were moving rather rapidly. The war was coming to an end, and people wanted to make sure that the U.S. was very interested in the scientists, and they were worried about the Russians might get them. And so things were moving for a government organization rather rapidly. And so we ended up in Landshut, and in 45, my dad went to Le Havre and took a ship from there to the United States. This was in 45. We ended up in 47 going up to Bremerhaven and taking a ship and coming over on it. These were both of them were troop ships, and I'll show you a picture of both of them. But so my dad actually went through France, and we went up through Bremerhaven on our journey over to America. Now here's this thing at the Raketenflugplatz. That's my dad right there, and you can see what they're doing is, you can see there's no protective gear, not even a leather apron or anything. They're pouring locks into a container, and everybody's just standing around. You know, it's just they weren't smoking, but I mean, it was close to it, close to it. Probably somebody in the background was, I would imagine. But you can just imagine these guys were all pretty casual looking, you know, and today there's no way we would ever be able to do something like this. You know, this is just, you know, like I said, in the early days, and these guys were careful, but I mean, there was some risk involved.
What were they pouring?
Liquid oxygen.
Oxygen.
Out of a door into a tank they were going, oops, went the wrong way. But here's the engine that they were going to fuel and run a test on it, see. And so they were over here fueling, and people were just, like what Daddy was standing around, there's several guys just kind of standing around, you know. Nowadays you put on scape suits and all this kind of stuff, you know, it's just a totally different world. I thought it was rather interesting. And this probably happened in Kummersdorf, is what I think it was in the early 30s. I think I've mistitled it because I said Raketenflugplatz, which is here on the northeast part, and Kummersdorf was on the south part of Berlin. But anyway, so I thought that was a rather interesting aspect of doing things. Now this was before computers. Here's just an example of the kind of plots that they did, and this is basically what they're plotting is, oops, went the wrong way again, wrong button. This right here is the gross takeoff weight of the vehicle, and this is the ratio of the drag from the air, of rocket going through the air, the drag relative in ratio to the gross takeoff weight. And what they found out is, you know, the larger rocket gets, it kind of levels off as far as the amount of drag on the vehicle. And so it talked a little bit about sort of the benefits you get from the larger vehicles in relation to how much drag you get on the vehicle. And so the scale of a vehicle was very important to them. And they were thinking about these kind of things already. This was before they were flying. I mean, you know, they were doing these kind of calculations by hand. Yes, Fred?
With a slide rule?
How was that curve anyway?
Slide rule, I suspect. And paper and pencil. And, okay, now one question that came up last time was, and I went back and tried to figure this out, and I put estimate up here because the numbers run all over the map, and I'm not quite sure how accurate this is, but this is kind of the best that I could put together of where all the people went from at Peenemünde. You know, you've always heard that a large part went to Russia, a large part went to the United States. But it turns out that Peenemünde actually had a lot of people there. And I've seen numbers high as 16,000 as far as number of people that were working up there on all sorts of different things. I mean, they were support people, running power plants, doing other projects. But there were a lot of people up there, and about 4,000 families. So you're talking about somewhere around 16,000 people working in Peenemünde, which kind of floored me when I thought it was, you know, a relatively small place, and there were, you know, several hundreds, but I didn't have any idea it was quite this large a group of people. And then trying to split this out into who went to Russia and who went to the United States, the best I could get was about 1,800 of these people, of the scientists out of 12,000, went to the United States. Now, really only 218 were rocket guys, okay? So a lot of others went to the Navy or somewhere else. They went all over the place. But the contingent that came to Huntsville was basically in this group of 218.
How was that decision made?
That decision was made just by this group of.
They made their own decision?
They made their own decision, decided they'd surrender to the U.S. Army, and that's how we ended up coming over here, okay? So.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, yes.
Congress limited the number that were allowed to come.
Yeah, but it was nobody directed it. Everybody was kind of worried about where they're going to go and what they're going to do. And now these people right here, I'm not sure had much choice. I think they just got taken and taken to Russia, okay? These guys didn't have much choice either in the sense of what we're going to do, but they decided to be proactive about it and decided, okay, the best choice to make would be to surrender to the U.S. Army and come to America and, you know, try to continue some of the rocket work, which is what happened. And out of all of these, now I don't know how many rocket guys went to Russia out of this number here, but you can see the numbers were almost equal in the sense of about half went to Russia, half went to US, but out of that whole group, only a very small percentage were rocket guys. And if you look at Kenny Mitchell's book that he just published, The Cradle of American Space Exploration, out of the 218, 208 moved to Huntsville. And of those 208, 158 transferred to the Marshall Space Flight Center in 1960 when it was formed. So about 50 of the guys, or 50, yeah, I guess about 50 of the people stayed with the Army. They didn't transfer over to Marshall.
Or they went to private industry.
Or they left, yeah. Okay, this is now the ship that sailed from Le Havre, France, that took my dad, and a whole bunch of people, and I'll show you the manifest in a second. But what they did is they left in November 1945 and arrived in November 16. So it was about a 7-day trip across the ocean. And it carried about 40,000 soldiers, 130 civilians, and 88 German scientists. And one bit of trivia I found just looking through it at the ship is that John Kennedy at JFK actually sailed on the Argentina later. And he sailed from the US to Brazil and Argentina. And they finally scrapped this ship in 1964 in New Jersey. And so it was scrap metal. Here's the manifest, and some of the names you probably recognize. And so Gruni, I mentioned him, Haukel. I don't know whether Jordan is here, but
He's here, right there.
Oh, there he is. I didn't even see him. Yeah. Haukel were on it. Geisler, Fuhrmann, Finse, Fichtner. So there's Dunberg. So there were a lot of people that on the ship that my dad. These were all the scientists. This was in '45. So these were the. This was strictly the guys. It wasn't the family. And
Right.
so here's the rest of the manifest, and you can see like Volker's dad was on that same ship, and you can see the other names on the people that were on that ship. An interesting point is, if you look right here, they annotated the manifest, and it says German prisoners of war. And so that's what they were considered at that time, and coming over. So we came over, the family came over, and Ursula already talked about it on the CC Baloo. And,
Were you on that ship?
beg your pardon?
Were you on the CC
Yeah.
Balloon?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, the
Looks like
Berger
you're on
listeners.
there.
Oh, okay.
Looks like a cruise ship compared to what I came over on.
Was it? Well, I can tell you it wasn't a cruise ship.
No,
I was sick as a dog. The whole 7 days or whatever it took. Let's see, it took from the 23rd, that's 7, it took about 9 days. This one's a little slower than the other one. It took 7 days, this took 9 days. And I was sick the entire time going across. I haven't been on a boat since, by the way. and don't plan any cruising. It was a emotional experience, a lot of trauma, I thought. So I've gotten away from boats or ships. But anyway, that ship was basically it was transferred to the U.S. Army in '46. It was a Navy ship, but the Army took over in '46, and then we came over in '47. It was an Army ship at that time, then later on it got transferred back to the Navy. And then finally, it got scrapped in Taiwan of all places in '81, so it's gone too. It no longer exists. And here's the manifest, and I'll show you some of the other names on it, but here's the Huter family, and let me just go on to the next slide, and you can see them a little better. You can see Badless are there, High Buys, down here, here's again our names. And if you go on to more, what you see is, you see Motsek right there, Ursula's family. Oops, went the wrong way again. Hit the wrong button. But here's Ursula right here and her family. And then the Ryzicks were on it. The Fuss was on there too. And so there's Hydroon. And so that was kind of the people that came over on that ship. Now, there were multiple ships that came over and brought families, but this was the ship that we came over on. And,
So glad to see that.
and when we got to El Paso, so the kids, we kind of played around a lot, and the parents, of course, the dad worked and mothers took care of the homes, and on weekends, we kind of always left, seemed like, because the desert was not exactly their favorite place. Even though, as kids, we kind of enjoyed the desert, and you know, it was very interesting to us, but to the parents, it was kind of desolate after Germany and all the green trees and stuff like that. So on a lot of weekends, we ventured to New Mexico, and Ursula mentioned a couple of those names,
Yeah.
but you can see some of the places we visited on weekends, and we drive and we'd be reading comic books in the back seat, and you know, the roads end in going to New Mexico, they kind of go along, then they dip down, was gullies for water washing through when they have some rain, you know, and stuff like that. But the roads just kind of followed the terrain. No bridges were built, they just kind of, and you'd sit there read. And my brother would get just deathly car sick just from the motion of that kind of stuff. But we'd sit back there in the back seat and read, and my dad would used to say, "Why don't you kids look around, look at all the wonderful scenery?" And, you know, yeah. Typical kids, you know, not interested. But anyway, so what we did is on weekends we'd go to these different places. This was about 150 miles kind of radius from El Paso. And when we went on longer vacations, we'd get up into the top part of New Mexico, like Taos, Red River. I fondly remember Red River because at that place we used to go up there and stay for a week or two, and we'd rent the horse by the day. And we'd take the horse back to our cabin and, you know, just keep it and just ride around wherever you wanted to. It was just, for a kid with a 6-gun, cat shooter, it was the ideal place to go to, you know. It was really, really nice, we thought. But one of the other stories on this is in Elephant Butte Dam Reservoir. One day my dad wasn't a fisherman or anything like that, so we hardly ever or had any kind of boat as such, so we never went to the Elephant Butte Dam, but he decided to borrow from Klaus's dad, blow-up boat. And so it collapsed. And so we put it in the car and drove up to Elephant Butte Dam. And then I'm sure it had a pump, but I remember us kids blowing on that damn boat for hours till we almost passed out. You know, I mean, it was larger than this table, probably 2 or 3 times the size of this table, and it had to be blown up. And that's the last time we went on that one. We revolted if he ever brought that one up again, that we'd have to go blow up a boat. But it was a nice boat.
Yeah, right.
But Ursula mentioned Carlsbad. Yeah, we went there too, you know, and the box lunch is down at the bottom after you went through the whole thing, and then you took the elevator back up after you walked down, and it was really nice and cool at the time too.
Yes.
Yeah. So But anyway, so these are all the places we visited and spent the weekends at. Got to see things like you don't see in Texas, chipmunks, squirrels, and those kind of things, wildlife, besides lizards and horned toads and, you know, those kind of things that we saw in El Paso. But it was really a fun time. We kind of enjoyed the excursion into the forest, especially my parents. Like I said, we kind of enjoyed the desert also, but I think they kind of got enough of it during the week. Now, Ursula mentioned also that we entered the United States. We came over, and we were kind of illegal immigrants, if you want to call it that. Sanctioned, though, by the Army, but still illegal immigrants, or non-existent immigrants like this. And in September of '49, they decided to make us legal. And so they took us all across the border, and like Ursula mentioned, that in the streetcar, we kind of rode across the border and became official, not citizens, but immigrants to the United States, legal immigrants. And these are just the official entry. And I got all this kind of stuff off of Ancestry. They've got all sorts of stuff on Ancestry.com. I'm amazed at the documentation they put down there. Okay, then after living in El Paso till 1950, and we decided, well, it's time to hit the road again. And so we took off, and in our Nash car, the Nash had a unique feature. People may not remember that, but you could make it into a bed. The back seat rest folded up. It hung up on the sort of on the straps, and then the bottom part, the seats folded down, so you had a bed below, and then you could even lay a child, which we were at that time, on top of the backrest, you know, by the window. So the way this worked is, at night when we stopped, Ike and I would sleep in the car. Mother and Dad and the daughter slept in the motel. And it saved having 2 motel rooms or getting something large, you know. Money was not exactly in excess at the time, and we were all struggling. But so we went to San Antonio, the Alamo, had to see that, you know, did a lot of sightseeing on the way up. It sounds like the same trip that you took almost. The one thing I remember, and I haven't been able to verify it, we had to kind of scoot out of Corpus Christi and take off and hustle back to Alabama, or hustle to Alabama, because there was a tornado or hurricane developing. Oh. And I've tried to look up the record of hurricanes at that time, but I never have found one existed. But I do clearly remember my parents talking about, hey, we gotta get moving. The hurricane's coming. We can't sit around and sightsee all day long. And so, you know, hustled the kids and us on to Alabama. So we got to Huntsville, or Alabama, and this was like late Sunday afternoon, and we decided to stop and have supper. And my dad ordered a beer and said, the guy kind of looked at him and said, what? So first of all, we don't serve beer. Second of all, it's Sunday, and we definitely don't serve beer on Sundays. And my dad kind of said, what kind of place are we moving to, you know? Unheard of. But anyway, so we headed on up to Huntsville and stayed there since. And I've been here ever since '50. Except for going off to school and occasionally, you know, trip to here and there, but basically put down roots and never left. It's one of these things, you know, after you traveled a lot, you kind of don't want to travel anymore. Well, that's kind of this whole itinerary kind of got me to that point.
And after that childhood, it's nice to put down roots, isn't it?
Right. So anyway, but that's all I had as far as the kind of a story of the itinerary of the trip that we went through. Okay.
So now we'll back up a little bit, and now you'll share some of your stories, escapades during your time in Fort Bliss.
Yeah, let me back up just a little bit, because just want to formally thank Heidi again for putting this together. Just unbelievable what's happened out of this just since the last time Uwe and I and the rest of the group did it with Volker, the three of us, and then
Gisela was here then.
yeah, and Gisela. And Gisela gave us a real good detail of the past, you know, in the early days, because they're just a little bit older, not much, but just a little bit older. So
She's older than me even.
yeah, right. Even, you know. And that was so helpful for me, because much of that, like I think Uwe and I agreed, that detail of what exactly happened and the conditions. You know, we were like 6.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, if you listen to some of the stories, they talk in great detail about the train trip coming down, about going to the dining car and doing this and doing that. It's all a fog to me. I mean, once I left the ship to El Paso, it's like, you know, the father meeting them at the train station. I don't remember any of that kind of stuff. I don't know whether I was under the weather from that brutal trip.
You hadn't recovered from the whole trip.
Well, what it was, I was still rocking back and forth probably.
Okay, but also Ursula, her experience was, I had not heard any of this, and that's the other thing. There's not been a forum really prior to this where we could share this kind of information. So I didn't have that, and I didn't get all of it from my parents, you know, like I should have. Didn't write it down either, and like you did, which was really, really helpful. So you got a real good feel, but I didn't know that she had really come a little differently to Landshut from, you know, several years later. Whereas in my case, in Uwe, we were in Peenemünde area, and from there went to Landshut, as he described. So, and this really helped me also, what Uwe put together today, or the other day, to see where all we had gone and the details of that. I did, and the manifest of the ships and so on.
Oh, yeah.
Unfortunately, I wasn't on that ship. So, I don't know what happened. No, but I did get some additional.
I'd like to get a copy of that.
Yeah, I did get some more specific information. Also, the other people like Jürgen Haukohl over here that did his part, and Peter Finzel and Klaus Heimberg, they really had some more details about Huntsville. And they were younger than I was, so, you know, I got another perspective there about how they were thinking, the way things happened. It was really, really fantastic. Now, those guys are real, almost like historians. They write everything down, and they make it like you're reading a book. I mean, it was absolutely fantastic. So I thank you guys for putting in all that work and the detail. And I'll just try to answer some questions for you if you have any afterwards, but I thought I'd share a couple of things that Uwe and I experienced, which is kind of different than a detailed storytelling or reading out a book. I can't do that very well. So, but let me just follow up by saying my dad was already with Werner von Braun in Kummersdorf, like Uwe's dad, and that's where he got involved, because they needed an electrical engineer kind of guy, electrical person, and that was my dad's background. And he lived pretty close to Kummersdorf, and that's so he got hired by them to do that. So he was fortunate to get in on the bottom floor here, just like Uwe's dad, just a small group of people. And from there, then they, of course, went to Berlin when things started heating up, and they thought they could use this for the rocket research for other purposes, and really got fired up by going to Peenemünde, and that whole complex, I must say, was something that I had seen it before from a distance and read about it, but I just was there this year with my daughter and granddaughter. And it was just unbelievable. Fortunately, Heidi got me somebody that could take me back to the actual Test Stand 7, where they put the first rocket into space. Just absolutely phenomenal. You can't even get in there, thanks to Heidi. She made arrangements because it's all been mined, from the Russians, tore everything up. But we were able to get in there with an old truck, and they took us right to the place and took some pictures. So it was just a significant event. And since I was born there and happened to be that my dad was in the plane with Werner von Braun to see where the test rocket is going, to see where it went down. And that's when I was born in 1940. And so that's how, my mom got the message to him that I came to life here in Pena Mendes. So I had some of the same things that Uwe pointed out. I didn't even put it together, but my dad didn't finish a house in Kropinzi, but he was working on it while the war was going on, while things were going on. But they didn't finish it, so we never got to move into Kropinzi in our house there. So we were still in the rest of the apartments where the rest of the families were. And I guess it was similar in Pena Mendes, like 4 families to a group, or maybe bigger, I'm not sure. But I do know, and of course this is what my dad tells me happened, and my mom, that the last group talked about the air raids. And I started thinking about that. I didn't really think that bothered me, and obviously I was probably too young and thought the noise was fine, but we did have to always go not directly to our basement, but the apartment next door had it was better reinforced. So we would have to go down there. Now some of those things came back when Gisela talked about that at our last one, that's what happened. And my dad, unfortunately, on one of those things, when they really came and bombed pretty heavily that apartment, my dad went back to hurry and gets his leather full-length coats, like you see in the movies from the old days. Is all leather for my mom. And when he went down in there, a bomb hit and the building collapsed, and so he was buried there. And my mom then, of course, knew he was still in there, and just like I think your dad or something, they had to dig him out, and so pretty emotional thing. So that's the other reason Uwe was mentioning they were trying to leave that area and move further south with the families, and that's of course what we kind of had the same route. I went the same route now that you've described it a little more as you did, going to Landshut. So anyway, quite interesting time. In Landshut, then I don't have that many memories either, other than what, again, Gisela and some of you have talked about. But I knew it was a pretty good time. The thing I do remember is that when the army came in, the Amis, came and marched through, they gave me chocolate and bubble gum, right? Chewing gum. That was cool. So I remember that. Beyond that, I just know my dad wasn't there. I think he was already on his way to the U.S.
Klaus, I assume, like myself, you probably started first grade in Landshut.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Because we used to get these, when you start school in Germany, they give you the Zuckertüte.
Right? Zuckertüte, yeah.
Yeah, it's a sort of a cone shape it looks like it's probably as tall as a 5-year-old almost, that is filled with candy.
Yeah, right. But I remember the Zuckertüte, but I don't remember much about the school.
I don't either. I remember Zuckertüte.
Yeah, but so
my kids have fun with that Zuckertüte.
But we wanted to, and in fact, I just got some of this information yesterday or today from von Braun's secretary. Doretta Schlitt is still alive, and she's still on it. I'm telling you, it's just unbelievable. So I talked to her, and I just wanted to ask her again about, because Uwe and I couldn't figure out, okay, what happened to me? Why didn't I get on the ship? that these guys were on. There was discrimination. But anyway, Doretta Schlitt was on the ship with my mom and my sister and I. But she didn't remember the name of the ship. It's a troop ship too, just like you did. Same way with my dad, he wasn't on this either on the ship that went first with your dad and the rest of you folks. So I asked her about that. He said, well, yeah, he went out of Bremerhaven, or Cuxhaven, actually, also up in the same place that we left, okay? So they went, because your dad went out of France, right?
Right.
So it was a little different, but we all got there just about in the same time frame. So we got to the U.S., my dad said 1947 in April. We got to at least, not Huntsville, but
Fort Bliss, yeah.
to Fort Bliss,
Yeah, the
about
men
that
got
time
there
frame.
in 46,
Yeah.
basically.
And he left earlier.
Yeah, we got there in June is what it.
You did? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, so that kind of gives you perspective. I did have one interesting thing when I was there this summer visiting my exchange student in Hamburg. We went to Bremerhaven and that area, just to see. And he said, there's a museum here where all the immigrants from many years all went through that, and they have those listed. So he said, you ought to look and see if you're in there. I just didn't think so because of all the stuff, know.
Yeah.
And so we looked it up. My gosh, it had, my name specifically, my mother's name she came from Horsfelde, my father from Beirut, but he wasn't on there. And then my sister, Anita. So they had all this detail. I could not believe it, even to the point that I'd gone to Huntsville and played in the band and had me playing my trumpet in the band. It's just amazing. So similar to the stuff you found on the internet, you can find everything there, I believe. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. So moving forward, then we go on the ship, and with Doretta Schlitt and her family and my mom was sick, my sister was sick. Fortunately, I was not very sick, is what Doretta said. I was all over the place, and was able to get oranges from all the soldiers, and had a great time on the ship. So I didn't have the problem Uwe had, so I have even a boat today. and enjoy it very much. So, but anyway, that trip across, I have few memories. Again, you had much better specific information about all that. It was really all very helpful. So finally then, same kind of thing, train to El Paso. We get there, and just like all the other, my dad was there, and obviously glad to see us. Tried to make the case that we better, they knew I liked chocolate very much, and my sister and my mom. And so we're going to give them chocolate right away, all they can have right now. No more, then you don't have to worry about it. They'll get sick of it. Well, guess what? We're still all chocoholics. Love chocolate and still do. German chocolate especially is good. So anyway, that didn't work out. So then El Paso, again, I just appreciated the detail that some of the people had. I think Folka had last time, how this was really set up, because I was, that's the place where everybody was together, okay? Right? All the families in Fort Bliss.
And so, the streets, yeah.
So here in these barracks, 4 families to the barracks. So we had, as I remember, I'm pretty accurate, I think I'm okay on this. The Palaoros, the Finsels, and Rosinskis and Seilers were all in one barrack. Those names probably mean something. And Uwe was, in that adjacent barrack. And so, my gosh, we were you know, this was a great time.
And Jürgen was
And
right
Jürgen
next
was
door.
close too?
He was right next door to us.
Okay, so these guys, you know, so we had instant playmates right there. We had these, she talked about the things going between the buildings
Yeah.
to ride down. My dad made
Fun, yeah.
me a wagon that went down there all the time, ran over people. It was just absolutely wonderful. And then we had the desert. Oh my gosh, that was a great thing. But before we get to the desert, I have to tell you a little bit of things. Uwe and I got in trouble a lot. You know, they had a PX there, and we could play, but you know, we'd like to buy something from the PX if at all possible. No money. And so while the soldiers in Fort Bliss were out on their maneuvers, marching and so on, Uwe and I and Ike made a little visit to their facilities.
That's my brother, by the way.
Oh yeah, Ike, and helped ourselves to some of their change that they left in the barracks. So, man, we thought that was, and then we went and I think like all of us maybe buy a Coke or some candy at the PX. I mean, this was really great. However, we thought this is so good, we're going back. Well, this time they were waiting on us. And it was ugly. Fortunately or unfortunately, Ike was the oldest, but not very fast. And they, not as fast as Uwe and I, we were blazing the trail out of there because they were coming after us, and they got Ike and put his head under hot water, which I don't think Ike totally recovered from that ever. And he, in fact, another story that Uwe might tell, he got hit on another thing like that. Ike was the target.
Let me tell that story while we're on money and Ike. And
please.
One afternoon, this mutual friend of ours, decided he borrow a little bit of money from his parents, unbeknownst to them, of course, and it amounted to about $10, which in 1948 was a lot of money, and especially for the people then that weren't earning much money. $10 was really a lot of money, and so he confiscated $10 from his mother's purse, and we decided there was a little casino at the far, and I'm not sure what north and east and west is on this thing, but it was in one of the far corners. There's a little building where the soldiers would go gamble in the evening. It had slot machines in it. And we knew, I don't know how we knew it existed. It's not a place for kids really, but we somehow knew it existed. Probably Klaus, you know, he's always getting us in trouble. But anyway, so we decided, us three decided to go and see what we can do with $10 and, you know, make a fortune. Well, we went there and blew the whole $10 in no time flat. And apparently somebody saw us. Or the guy that ran the place kind of says, "No, what are these kids doing with all this money, throwing all this down these, you know, one-armed bandits?" And so it came up that says, "Hey, we saw a bunch of kids over there gambling, and these were the kids' names, you know." So it got back to the parents, and well, my parents didn't know anything about it. The other family didn't know a thing about it, and I guess probably my dad or my mother confronted the other family, said, "Hey, you know, what's going on here? You know, the stories." And the other family says, "Listen, my kid, he was the only boy." He said, "He's an angel, he wouldn't do anything like that. It's gotta be you guys, you know." And so Ike, going back to Ike, he's my older brother, he was kind of somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure how the story spun out, but it probably got out, and you know how it goes through the grapevine, and the guy found out that, or he thought that Ike ratted on him, is the reason that the parents had to get together, and they had this little confrontation, and and of course nothing happened there because everybody denied anything like this could ever happen with their kids. And so the guy was decided, well, he's going to get a little revenge on him. So he caught Ike one day and just beat the crap out of him because of this, because he thought that he was ratting on our little escapade at the casino. And so Ike seemed to get the brunt of some of the bad stuff.
He did.
And
he was the smartest guy. He was a lot smarter than movie now.
Oh, yeah. But anyway, there was another story that while we're on stories that, speaking of the desert, we used to sneak out, the fence is, it's sort of like the border now, if there's a fence, you go underneath it or you climb over it. Well, this was tall enough we couldn't climb over it, plus it probably had razor wire on top of it. So we dug underneath it and got out in the desert and goofed around. And parents would notice, hey, where's my kid, the guy's nowhere around, and so they call the MPs, and the MPs drive out in the desert in their Jeeps and find us out there playing around, just having a grand time. So this happened on occasion. Yeah, I'm sure the MPs got a big laugh out of this too. They probably had better ways to spend their time. But then one day, Klaus and I decided to do a missionary trip and visit some of the locals, which I thought was a friend of the family to the Rosinskis. But I'll let Klaus tell the story because I think he can do a better job of it.
Well, what happened, obviously, we wanted to explore, and you could see houses on the other side of the so-called desert place, and then you could see, but that's quite a long way. So we got some water, and took off on our journey over there just to check it out, and so it's quite a walk, and in the hot sun, whatever, and. So we get there and we see a lady out in the garden there, and she's, my gosh, where'd you come from? I'm kind of like, well, we said, well, we're here and so on. And then she said, oh my gosh, you got to come in and get some, some more water, cookies, whatever. And Uvi actually remembered the cookies she gave us. I forgot that. She gave us cookies and talked to us, was so nice to us. Another example of, I'm sure they knew these were German scientists, from Germany, that was the enemy. And, we didn't even think about that might be an issue. Well, it certainly wasn't, because she was just as nice as she could be. And so I think we might have done that visit again. And we got to know these people, the Ethertons, and they had a daughter that was about my sister's age, and we ended up being able to go visit them, with my parents through that connection. And so they had a lot of nice clothes for my sister that their daughter didn't, and my mom got some from them, and my dad got some, but they didn't have a son. And so one day I didn't get nothing. So then one day they come pick me up, and formally, and made arrangements to pick me up at the gate there, and took me to El Paso, and they dressed me out from top to bottom with a cowboy suit, boots, a hat, and 2 6-shooters. And the pearl buttons, for cowboys. I died and gone to heaven, I'm telling you. Best day of my life, significant emotional event, I call it, in my whole life. And that was just fantastic. So those people ended up being friends, for a long time while we were in a great connection, which I'm sure many of the other Germans didn't have, so that was really neat. So some really good times. It's just that we had a lot of time on our hands, so we got into some trouble. The problem was we still had to go to school, and this school thing, you already commented on that, the high-low, and that kind of made me mad because I had just started in the first grade, And so then Mrs. Axter and some of the Heller, I believe, whatever, some of the other ladies there were trying to teach us German, how to write German. Well, and then we had to go to school to learn English. So we got hit twice there for having to go to school, and that didn't leave much time. And then they did, I think you might have mentioned that they had also tried to have a school there, had a little school on site to teach us, in the summertime. So there, so there was a lot of schooling going on. They were really worried about our educational process. And I guess that was all good. One of the things I wanted to say that I think is important, my mom got left out of interacting much with any Americans, all the women. So, the men integrated through their job, the kids went to school and integrated that way. We learned unbelievably fast English, I think that's fair to say. But the moms staying at home, they had a hard time. When we finally got to Huntsville here, now that all changed because now people could live wherever they wanted to. So it's a major change in integrating into society, because you can't really say we integrated there in El Paso, right? So this was really a big deal. And that's how you heard some of you talked about, I think, Crowd Hill over there. So some, like Uwe said, he lived up on the hill there. My dad bought a house, and I think there might have been a picture. It's similar to that house, as you probably see it going by on Carmelian Drive between Locust and McClung. So you had a lot of the Germans up on the hill, like Uwe and those guys that said the Finsels, and Von Braun was on McClung, and we had them all up there, and then close to me also, there were Hauko was just around the corner from me, so we had a lot of Germans in that area. Then you had some on the mountain, I assume, at that time as well, that went up there. And then Longwood area, wasn't that another area?
There were apartments on Longwood.
Some apartments. So, they scattered all over. And that really allowed, I think, the women and of course all the rest of us to really get to know, other American neighbors. And we were really fortunate because where we lived on Locust, where Von Braun had moved out in the rental house, right by California, on the, right by east.
McClung and California.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's
corner.
Locust in California. Right? Locust in California is the first place we moved into, and that was right by Guy Spencer's dispensers, and Evans, the doctor, and attorneys, and people like that. So we right away, my mom and dad, they just took us in like we were neighbors from the U.S. It was just fantastic, and they played with their kids and got to know them, went to school with them. So this was really neat, the way we were treated. And I think that's still a big thing that a lot of people are surprised at, how well you folks in Huntsville took care of the people that came in from the outside. And that was really neat. I better slow up.
Here to Huntsville. So let's go ahead and hear from
Volker. Because we probably talked too much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Volker Roth, his brother Axel Roth, whom many of you knew as the Deputy Director at Marshall Space Flight Center. We're all very proud of Axel for his accomplishments. However, his brother decided he would not pronounce it Roth. He kept the German pronunciation. So, may I introduce Volker Roth.
Thank you. I stuck with my dad's pronunciation, and it made it a lot harder, but my brother was a much nicer person than I was. So, let's see. I think we've covered a lot of the stuff that I covered last time, so I'm going to kind of skim through things a little bit quickly. I'm always interested that you guys came in 47, yet you were a little bit older than I was. And I came in 46, and I'm younger. I'm not sure how they got that all swirled around. Yeah, but at any rate, yeah, we came before.
I checked the birth certificate.
We arrived in New York about the 14th or 15th of December of 1946, and pardon?
You went on the George Goodfiles, George W. Goodfiles.
You
right
know,
on the 18th.
If you say so. I'm not going to dispute you right now, but I just gave you a general time frame. So, at any rate, like everybody else, we ended up bypassing Ellis Island, went straight over the train depot, and we got put on the train to El Paso. And the nice thing was, as you had mentioned, you had the car where we were in, and then we had the dining car next to it. And so that was our domain for 3 days. The best thing about that was we had not had really good fresh fruit in Europe for a long time before we came. And every day when we went to eat, there were apples and bananas and oranges. I mean, oranges were always a big thing. So it was just an absolute good time from that standpoint. And like them, we got the announcement that we were going to cross the Mississippi River. And of course, we're all really interested in seeing that. Without doubt, the biggest river we'd ever seen. There are no rivers of that size in Europe. And then later on that day, they said, we're now going to be entering Texas. Well, you had 3 young boys who had read comic books about Indians and the bad guys and the good guys in the wild, wild west. And I'm going to tell you, we were glued to the window watching for the cowboys and Indians outside the window in Texas. And if you've ever gone from the border of Texas to Dallas, it doesn't even look like anything in the movies from that standpoint, okay? So that was a grave disappointment. Of course, by the time we got to Dallas, it was getting dark, and so we never saw any cowboys and Indians on the way across. But we did arrive the next morning, and my dad had gotten a cab, and he met us at the train depot, and it was great to be all back together again. And then, this was supposed to be talking about that beautiful time of learning how to live in Fort Bliss. And it was quite a remarkable change, as you've heard from everyone. Our situation was a little bit different because we had 4 boys already. My mother and her mother had passed away early from breast cancer, and she had raised her sister. And so her sister was like another child, so there were 5 children, essentially. She, at that time, was 17 years old when we arrived in Fort Bliss. So what they did is they decided the easiest thing to do was to give us an entire barrack. And the barrack we got was a portion of the hospital. You came into the barrack, and it had a whole bunch of rooms right and left. And one of them was a kitchen. There was a laundry. There were a couple of bathrooms. There were a bunch of bedrooms and so on. Then you walked through the next doorway, and lo and behold, here was the ward. And that thing had to be at least 30 feet wide and 50 feet long, and there wasn't a thing in it except linoleum. Okay? And so that was kind of an awakening. And on the other end was a very large room with the entire width, and it was for isolation cases and so on that they used to have in the hospital. So that became our living room. So that's what we lived in when we were there, basically. And it was better than a lot of places we'd been in the meantime. Uwe talks about the bombing raids in Peenemünde. Turns out I was born probably in the same hospital Uwe was, up there in Swinemünde. And when the big raid came, I was a year old. I don't really remember anything about it, except I have a brother, Axel, who wrote some memoirs, and the big thing he wrote about was the bombing raid and how that affected us. There were 2 families in the building. We had a 2-story building. There was a family upstairs and our family downstairs. And when the raid came, we all went to the cellar. And the raid went on for 90 minutes of solid bombing. Most of the time, you couldn't even hear airplane engines. It was just one bomb after another going off. And when it was over, there was an eerie silence. And then people started coming out, and we heard soldiers, or my family heard soldiers outside, and they ended up having to dig us out of the cellar because the house was basically destroyed. So I like that from the fact that, but for the grace of God, I wouldn't be here telling you this story at this point, you know. But at any rate, so the big barrack was really kind of a nice thing. They were pretty rudimentary, had a lot of leaks and so on. If it got cold, it was kind of frigid, and it was always hot, it seemed like, and so you had to deal with that. But the biggest problem I remember having is I was young at that time. I was 4 years old when I arrived and 8 when I left in 1950 and went to Huntsville. But I wasn't real big on cockroaches. And I learned very quickly that you made sure that your bladder was totally empty before you went to bed, because if you had to get up in the middle of the night, it was going to be traumatic, you know. Because you turned the light switch on, the entire floor would leave. So it was kind of gross, yeah. We finally ended up getting that under control, but it was a rude awakening. And you mentioned the airfield close by. Well, in Europe, I learned to be very attuned to high altitude bombers and the noise they would make when they started dropping bombs. And I was the biggest chicken. I was always in the cellar first. I'd hear that, and I was gone. Okay. Well, it was different in El Paso from the standpoint that we had that airport next door, and when the wind changed, you ended up flying directly over the barracks into the landing field. And they would come over the barracks very, very low a lot of times. My mother swears that one of them hit the top of our barrack once. I'm not sure I believe that, but to expand on that a little bit, I had a brother who for Christmas that year had gotten a bow and arrow. They were still on this Indian kick. And when the planes would come across that low, he decided he could probably hit one of them. So when the planes came over, here he is out in the yard with his bow and arrow. Now, he doesn't know if he ever hit one, but he swears that the arrows went higher than the airplane. So at any rate, those good times for the kids. That area obviously is all desert, and as a result, there are a lot of dust storms. Well, if you have a dust storm and you're in the annex, you're going to have dust. I mean, you're going to have a lot of dust, okay? And we had a very big one not long after we moved into this barrack. And, the next day, you're obviously trying to figure out how to get all the dust out. Well, we found a very unique way of doing that. We had this youngest brother who was about 1.5 years old at that time, and he fit right on a blanket well. Guess how we cleaned the ward? Drag him around the ward, make big piles of dust right in front of the door, and then shove it out the door. So you take a chore and you made it into something that was a lot of fun. He enjoyed it, and we enjoyed the heck out of it at the same time. There were a lot of things that we had to learn when we came to this country. There were a lot of things that were absolutely wonderful, and for me, that continues today. But back then, in Europe, you really didn't have any vending machines that I ever remember, or that my brothers ever remembered. And here they had Coca-Cola, and it came in a vending machine, and for a nickel, you could get a bottle of Coke. But nobody had a nickel, and we didn't rob the guys. My oldest brother and his friend, Karl-Heinz Ball, got a nickel from Karl-Heinz's mother. And they waited. We weren't supposed to be in the areas where the scientists were doing their work, but it was kind of all very close. And that's where the vending machine was. And so they waited until they had an opening, and they went in there and they put their nickel in, they opened the door, they got their Coke out, and then they ran. Cool. Guess what? They forgot to open it. You ever try to open one of those old Coke bottles without a can opener? 2 of them, with rocks and sticks and everything, kept trying to open that thing. They finally got it bent up enough that they could drink the Coke out of it, but the lid never came off the bottle. So that was just kind of a rude awakening. Another thing that happened that was fairly interesting, my brother Dieter was he was the wild child in the family, basically. We'd been told that you need to not go down the long halls between the buildings, especially in the areas where the workers were, because you were disruptive. Well, he had gotten this tricycle, and he'd ride the tricycle around in the ward. Well, that got to be kind of boring after a while, and he decided he could go faster if he went out there in those halls. So he gets his tricycle and he goes out in the halls, and they have the swinging doors between every barrack, basically. And he'd go through the swinging doors, and he got all the way down to the end, and it worked really well, and he was having a great time. He started coming back, and all of a sudden a couple of the swinging doors in front of him opened up, and here were 2 MPs with rifles. Now, he'd grown up in Germany during the war, and he'd been told by my mother that when you're around soldiers with guns, you put your head down, behave yourself totally, and you don't mess with it. Well, these guys, I think they were trying to be nice to him. They're trying to talk to him. Well, he was scared to death. He thought, I'm in trouble. They're going to shoot me. Okay. So he's trying to figure out how to get away, and one of the guys reached in his pocket and got out some gum, took out a stick of gum and tried to hand it to him. He said, something being given to me by a stranger in a silver package. Now they're trying to poison me. So he managed to take off and got away. But when you look back at it, it was a traumatic experience for him, but it was, the MPs were really just trying to communicate with him, and he couldn't communicate back. So we learned very quickly what all was going on. The most fun activities were probably the swimming pool. Summertime, if we could, we went to the swimming pool. Everybody, all the young people did. And I had learned to swim a little bit in Europe, but I really learned to swim well there. And my older brothers, they were regular swimmers already, but my youngest brother had gotten to be 3 years old by this time, and he was just absolutely fearless. And sometimes I wonder if his head was all there, but he just wasn't afraid of anything, basically. I would not go off the high board in that swimming pool. I mean, there's just no way you're going to get me up there in the first place. But with him, we ended up having to put a life vest on him because we couldn't control where he was going half the time. He didn't know how to swim, and he'd just jump in the water wherever he wanted to. Okay? Well, the next thing you know, we weren't paying enough attention, and who's standing up on top of the high board but this 3-year-old? And he's standing right on the tip of the board, and then he just falls over. And he did a perfect flip and landed on his feet, comes up laughing like hell. And I thought, wow, for the rest of the time we went to the pool, we couldn't stop him from doing it. He thought that was just the greatest thing in the world, and he did it rather well. So a lot of things turned out to be fun. There's been a lot of discussion about going out in the desert, and we would play hide and seek. We would have mini wars. We would chase lizards. I remember my brother one time, he and his friend ran into a Gila monster. They tried to shoot him with a BB gun, and he swore the BBs just bounced off of him. Now, if you ever see the Gila monster, they've got really a thick skin. You're not going to hurt them with a BB gun, But we never did see any snakes out there. I don't know. I'm sure there were snakes, but we just never crossed them. And the business with going out of the fence was always an issue. There were 2 gates, but they were pretty far apart from the center area. And so most of the kids did what you guys did, dug holes under the fence. Going over didn't work out very well, but going under was just easy. But my friend and I got stuck out. Well, we didn't get stuck. A dust storm came up real quick, and all we could do was remember the fence is kind of in this direction. And we walked until we ran into the fence, but you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. I mean, we were just basically blind until we got to the fence, and then you can find your way once you get there. We also, at that time, learned a lot of the American sports. baseball, basketball, those kind of things just weren't played in Europe. And a number of years back here in Huntsville, to show you what a small world this is, I was the president of the Madison County Schools Foundation, and I was dealing with the Huntsville City School board. And I ran into a guy there whose name was Topper Burney, and Topper is sitting right back there. Stand up, Topper. And it turns out that he said, "Hey, I know your brother." I said, "Where do you know my brother from?" He said, "Fort Bliss." I said, "How in the world is that?" And he said, "Well, my dad," it turns out Topper's dad was the historian for the Army who had been sent to Fort Bliss to capture some of the history that was in the making there. And the thing that was the big call for Topper was he had every manner of baseball, bat, gloves, basketball, all the sports stuff you could ever imagine. And he taught those German kids how to play those games at that time. And then I run into him right here in Huntsville, Alabama. It's just an absolutely amazing world, isn't it?
It is.
Let's see, we've talked a little bit about school and the way school worked with the lower and upper and all that, and how we came into it. I came into the system down there in the first grade because I was still too young to go to school in Europe. But the guys that started in the older grades, they ended up being held back initially until they got more proficient at the language. But the Army did a pretty good thing. They decided that all these kids had a lot of energy. They were going to be tough to manage during the summer. And so what they did is they brought in a teacher to teach us English during the summer. And they taught some of the other subjects, but we would go to this class. Well, my brother remembered the teacher's name. He's always been really good with remembering names. Her name was Miss Outlaw. Okay? You figure out why he remembered, right? At any rate, she was apparently a really good teacher. He really liked her. And when she wasn't teaching, she was telling him, "At the end of the summer, I'm going to get married and I'm going to get rid of that damn name." She was just happy as a pig in the mud about that. Let's see, the other things I'd mentioned, when my older brother, for example, started in school, they still used slate and a stylus to write their work on. And then they eventually graduated to paper, but by that time it was the middle of the war and paper was a hard to find commodity. So they had a mindset on how they dealt with paper. When he started going to school, they would have lesson plans, and they would have problems. They would have to write the tests and write the answers. And he would hand in his sheet of paper, and everything would be, the entire answers to the question would be on a space about that big. And the teacher came and said, "We have more paper. I'd like you to write a little larger." So, again, something that we had to learn here that was a bit different. The other thing that was kind of interesting to me when I researched doing this, when initially Heidi asked me to do it, I thought, God, I'm covering from 4 years old to 8 years old. This is going to be a really short talk. But then I talked to my brother Dieter, and after having him on the phone for a half an hour, he finally admitted that he knew a couple of things he could tell me. And my brother Axel did a great job of writing some memoirs. And he captured a lot of really good things. But it was really interesting to note that everyone always asks, how were we accepted in school in El Paso when we had to go to public school? Axel's response to that was, it was a wonderful transition, basically. The teachers were great, the students were great, everything was just really good. And after thinking about that for a while, I think what happened is it was so close to after the war that the Army discussed with the teaching staff that they were going to have these children, they were going to have potential problems between young children who'd lost their fathers in the war and then have German students next to them. And they made it all clear to everyone that this was supposed to be a good interface. And as a result, it was, okay? But then 3 years went by before my next brother ended up going to school. And when I asked him about that, he said, it kind of sucked. We were on the receiving end of a lot of stuff. He said it even got to the point where I would ask the teacher 10 minutes before school was out if I could go to the restroom. And then I'd take off and start walking back to Fort Bliss because I could avoid a lot of the confrontations I had to run into. So I thought that was kind of an interesting difference. And then my memory when I started going to school was different again. There was nothing to do with us being Germans. Of course, at that point, I'd already learned a lot of English, and so I could communicate well. And my only problem was that I was, at that time, my two brothers had grown very quickly. They were older, obviously, but I was still the runt of the litter at that time. Kind of best way to put it. I was short. I was not very heavy, and boy, I was an easy target for anybody that needed someone to whack on. So I was pretty fast, but I didn't get away all the time. And for me, the bus was actually a great thing. Had an MP on it. That guy didn't let anything happen to any of his kids on the bus. Had this great big long seat in the back you could lay on. By the time you got home, your nose would stop bleeding. Your mother wouldn't be upset with you. So I thought it was cool. But 3 very different experiences, but none of them really bad. Dieter's was probably the worst that he walked, but he was kind of a loner anyway. He probably loved that walk back to El Paso or Fort Bliss anyway. And some of the folks have talked about camping trips. Camping trips were absolutely the greatest. First time we took a camping trip, there were a number of people that went together, and we were shadowed by some MPs. And we finally, they only did it once. They finally decided, this is crazy. I mean, we're sitting around here watching these people having a good time. And nobody's bothering them, and they're not trying to get away or anything. And so it didn't happen again, but we did get shadowed the one time. And what my dad had done is he had gotten a used army tent that slept 8 people. And of course, I had this huge, long, 2x4 in the middle, holding the center of the tent up. And he cut it in 3 pieces, and built a contraption to put it all back together again, so we could put the tent up. And we would take off every opportunity we could and go camping at all the places you had on your map. We've been to all of them, with that tent, and everything fit in the trunk of the car. We ended up having a 1940 Chrysler. But, you didn't need station wagons back then. They had these huge trunks already. So that worked out really well. We also took a trip up to White Sands, and fortunately for me, that was during a time when they actually had one of the V-2 launches, and I got to see my first real launch that I could appreciate from White Sands, just laying in the sand not too far away. And that impressed the heck out of me. Fortunately for that, it kind of sent me down a career path that I really enjoyed and that was really good to me. And as a result, I did a lot of work in the space business, and I loved every minute of it. I'll mention some of that at the end. I forgot, Heidi, you told me to do that. Yeah, just real quickly, the very last thing I was going to say, when we took that trip down to Juarez to come back to the United States as immigrants, I'll never forget being in that room with the guy. The guy had his feet up on his desk, and another guy was shining his shoes. And he just asked us about 3 questions, and then he stamped the paperwork. We got on the bus and went back to the U.S. Shoes looked good after that, I can tell you. And I think, we're getting toward the end. We got to wrap up real quickly. I'll just tell you that I did go into the space business. I started at the Douglas Company on the West Coast after getting a degree from University of Southern California, and started on the Apollo program on the 3rd stage of the Saturn V. Loved all of that. I spent 11 years as the program manager for Space Lab, where we flew out a lot of missions and did a lot of stuff in the near Earth orbit. And went on to be our program manager for the next shuttle derivative that we were trying to move forward, and just ended up having a great 42-year career. Started with Douglas, McDonnell bought us, so then I was McDonnell Douglas, and years later Boeing bought us. So I retired from Boeing and never changed companies.
Thank you very much. Just take you back in time a little bit. Thank you all very much for sharing your stories. How about some questions? Anyone have any questions? We've got just a few minutes remaining. If you've got any.
I'd like to ask Ruby,
Okay.
when I came to work at Marshall, the 9 laboratories were headed up by Germans.
Right.
At some point, a few years later, somebody made a decision in Washington, I've heard. Is there any detail you can give to place those guys?
Well, that was 74 is when that
Yeah.
when it occurred.
What is the question?
The question was, the question was when Fred Applegate first came to work for NASA, or Marshall Space Flight Center to be specific, that all of the labs were basically being managed. The directors of all the labs were Germans. And something along the way happened that all the Germans left and very few managers were Germans after a certain period of time. That time was 1974. And Rocco Petrone from KSC came up, and he was sort of the hatchet man to take care of the power structure, let's put it that way, that existed at Marshall Space Flight Center. Von Braun had already been transferred to Washington, D.C.
It was a sad day.
And the guys were offered jobs. Some of them were demeaning. They just retired and went home. And a lot of them stayed very active. I know Mr. Heimberg. Is Klaus here?
No, he's not.
Oh, but he just started working projects after projects after projects. His wife was out there helping him solve stuff, and he's building and building and building. But these guys, rather than take a job that was, I won't say demeaning, but lower than where they had been, decided they'd rather retire than be put under those kind of conditions. And so most of them left in that time period. And then Rocco left, and things started normalizing again a little bit. But that period of 74, 75 time frame is when all this was occurring. Now, Von Braun left earlier than that, but that was the beginning of that happening.
I'd like to say something in all fairness.
Sure.
I've read P.D. Nicase's memoirs.
Yeah.
And it was an aha moment for me because I've always viewed it from the German perspective.
Right.
And reading his memoirs, it was like Apollo was over then. That decision had been made. So it was one of those times similar to what we went through a few years ago. It was just a downward spiral. So the Americans also. It was a big,
well, I mean, the whole center,
essentially.
Yeah. Because
right, but all of the directors then.
At the height of Apollo, we were about 7,000 people at Marshall. Mm-hmm. And then that ended, and we went into Skylab program. Mm-hmm. And but the transition from the German management to the American management happened after Rocco Petrone came in and cleaned.
It was pretty abrupt.
It was abrupt,
Right,
yeah,
very abrupt.
very much so. It was pre-planned. I mean,
Okay.
it was done that way, and for whatever reason.
All right. On that controversial note, any other questions? Yes.
What was the upper and lower school? You were talking about the lower third and the upper third.
Oh, in school, they were like half grades, and you were in the half grade, and then the next half. I think Birmingham Birmingham did that when my college roommate was in school there.
It's sort of like the first semester is lower,
First
and the
semester,
second
second
semester is
semester, and
higher.
you could skip. And if you skipped one semester, then if you moved somewhere else, you could skip the second semester and be a grade ahead.
They can start school in January.
Right, that's why.
Yeah.
That's why we start high.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because they graduated both times.
Okay.
In December and in May.
That's right.
Yeah.
Birmingham did that at one time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your fathers, were they during the military, or were they separate?
Some were, and they were brought in. My father, for instance, he was pulled off the train in Berlin, given orders to go to some secret place, get on that other train, and then they were brought as civilians then. Up at Peenemünde, they became civilians.
Okay, my
So to
father-
work on the rocket program.
Yeah,
So-
my father was wounded in the war, and while he was recovering in the hospital, he was recruited for Peenemünde.
So they're
in
all sorts of different stories.
42.
My father was a dive bomber flyer. And when he got recruited into the space business, he left the military as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something to you two.
Okay, Topper, keep it
That
clean.
hole that you dug under the fence.
Yeah.
The Army reacted a certain way. Every parent that had a youngster there was quizzed. And I never could convince Daddy that, no, Daddy, I never did crawl under the fence.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, did you have a question? One last question.
When you were going on your field trips to Carlsbad and those other areas in New Mexico, how were you able to communicate with the Americans? Do you speak English well enough to do that?
Yeah. It may have been broken
But-
English, but
But
yeah.
some of them had trouble early on. I had some stories from Mr. Janowski who mixed up the word vacation with vacancy. And so he goes at the middle of the night, they couldn't find a place, and he goes up there and say, "Do you have vacation?" Did not go over very well. But amazingly, they learned English very quickly. And
They had seminars every evening. They taught each other before the wives got there.
Yeah,
So-
when we arrived a year after my father came here, he spoke basically fluent English already. So they got a lot of exposure.
Yeah, they've been in the States 2 years before we even arrived, see. So,
Marquez one.
well,
It seemed like 3 years.
But they had lessons in the evening, what their expertise was, they were to teach the others, and English lessons. So those that were better at English, like Magnus von Brown, they gave English lessons. And then the wives later did that with each other. I understand that Mrs. von Brown, they lived in Huntsville for 3 years. That Dr. von Brown's mother also taught some of the wives. I've heard that recently.
So, Heidi, how old were you when you learned to speak English?
I was 1 when I moved to Huntsville, so if you've seen pictures, we were racing around Colonial Hills. There was 20 or so other German families, so we wanted to speak English. We wanted to belong. We did not want to speak German.
same thing.
And I'm guessing your parents.
My family was the same way.
I had to speak it at dinner, and my sister, but we balked against it. Any other time, it was, we wanted to be.
that seemed to be common.
We wanted to be Americanized.
Speaking
So.
German at home,
Yes,
you know,
but we-
once you get out of the household, it was English.
It's interesting how some of you have retained your a little bit of an accent, and others of you have seemingly no trace of it too. I've got one, and mine's not Alabama. It's a darn old Arkansas accent. But no, I do a little bit with some.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again. Thank you to the panelists.